of the series and the first live lecture in a virtual setting for 2020. Exciting, thanks for coming. I hope that you have a mug or a glass, maybe even a flute, some snacks. I hope maybe you're wearing something comfortable or cozy, that you have a pen and paper or something to type on. If we can't be together physically, I want to encourage your virtual comfort. You've been muted on entry with video turned off, and we ask that you stay that way. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. You can actually use the drop down so that it goes directly to the Milton Library, where Mary from the Milton Library will be helping to facilitate Q&A. This lecture is being recorded, and the resources will be shared in a follow-up email post-lecture. My name is Carolyn, and I work for Wilfrid Laurier University, and I am so proud to be a part of this partnership with the Milton Public Library. The Laurier Milton Lecture Series provides a wonderful opportunity to engage in public dialogue with citizens of Milton and beyond in this virtual setting on a broad array of important topics. Presentations represent the current research and analysis of members of different faculties, departments, and programs at Laurier. Lectures are every second Wednesday of the month, so we hope to see you at our next lecture on October the 14th. Before we begin the program this evening, I would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is a part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and symbolize the agreement to share, protect our resources and not engage in conflict. The treaty was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest preserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory after losing much of the territory to settlement of newcomers. Perhaps you're not joining us from this location, maybe you're in a different location. If that's the case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land, where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water. And now I'm very excited to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Ardavan Eizadirad, is currently an associate professor in Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University and is an instructor in the School of Early Childhood Studies at Ryerson Universities and is in the Master of Teaching program at OISE with the University of Toronto. He is also an educator with the Toronto District School Board and the author of Decolonizing Educational Assessment, Ontario Elementary Students and the EQAO. In his lecture this evening, we'll discuss the importance of centering equity, diversity, and inclusion in schools and communities to create better supporting environments that reflect the needs of vulnerable students and community members. The goal is to advance the dialogue beyond the critique to discussing action-oriented alternative approaches to mitigate systematic barriers perpetrated through inequality of opportunity. This is an important topic and why I will waste no more time and pass the mic to the doctor. Thanks so much.
All right, well, welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it, and it's nice to see the variety of locations people are putting in the chat where they're coming from. So I'm going to go into sharing my screen as I have a PowerPoint presentation prepared for tonight, and we'll try to leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end for us to engage in dialogue and conversation. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to address them at the end and get into a conversation. Thanks for the introduction, Caroline. As the topic was already promoted, it's about equity, diversity, and inclusions. And we're going to talk about it broadly, but bring it back to our schools and communities. And specifically try to maybe shift your thinking about how we look at the achievement gap instead of just focusing on the outcome, looking at the processes that go into creating that outcome, which largely has to do with inequality of opportunity. So I know I was into, we did the land acknowledgement, so I won't spend time, but some of these slides will be available later on and some great resources to check out at the bottom. One of them is Whose Land, which is a great app, which regardless of where you are, it will provide you a historical explanation of how that land connects to indigenous people and experiences. And it's important to kind of do that. I was already introduced, but in a nutshell, my two passions are education and sports. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm active there and I post a lot of stuff. And my book came out last year looking at decolonizing educational assessment, which some of the big ideas I will share with you today. But it's also important in my field of work for us to situate ourselves and to openly share how my perspectives on the topics are formed. So I'm largely impacted by my own lived experiences. I immigrated to Canada from Iran in 1998. You know, being an immigrant, self-identifying as male, Muslim, and being a racialized person, these all impact my lens of how I engage with these topics. I grew up in Toronto, in the inner city, and being an educator from kindergarten to a range of high school grades, as well as teaching across multiple post-secondary institutions, each with different demographics and community needs, all impacted me. And believe it or not, that's me in a picture with long hair, but as you can tell, I've lost a lot of it now for good and bad reasons. Also, as a caution, I mean, we're going to engage in some conversations which perhaps might make you feel uncomfortable. Maybe you disagree with it. Maybe it'll get you angry and sad. We'll look at some stats, but that's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. The question becomes, what will you do with those emotions and how will you channel them to be constructive about it? You know, if you do feel that way, take a moment to take a deep breath, reflect upon what contributed to that strong reaction and what perspectives, values, and ideologies those feelings are rooted in. That's something I even use myself when I'm teaching and learning with my students, because we're all on this path of continuously learning, and self-reflection is a big component of that. Okay, so I'm going to come to the topic from a different perspective, kind of talking about children. And, you know, it's back to school time, and many parents are kind of, there's a lot of anxiety whether to send their children to school, how will they support them? So I want you to think of this concept of first hour needs, and it applies to children and adults. And the concept is pretty much when you wake up, what are your first hour needs? And this is going to be different for each and every one of us. How do you start your day? What are your usual rituals and practices? I know some people really need that coffee before they get going. Some people really wake up at the same time every day and have a routine. And what do those needs represent, right? Is it food? Is it affection? Is it humor? And then more importantly, what happens if those needs are interrupted or unmet? How do you react if you wake up 15 minutes late? How do you react if you forget something at home when you leave the house? How does that have a ripple effect to the rest of your day? And that's important. And I want you to take that same thinking and apply it to your children or your grandchildren or the people you work with, right? And adults as well. And so what are first hour needs? I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but here are some things that we all need as human beings, whether we're children, adults, different races, backgrounds, ethnicities, and so forth, right? Acknowledgement, nutrition, the need for clear communication, socializing, touch. Some need some of these more than others, but we all need them to a certain capacity. And when it comes to children and adults, as we know, some people really like structure, and some people, they don't respond too well with structure. And that's something we're going to talk about once we get into the school system and talking about diversity and inclusion a little bit more. But what's important is, and the point I want to make is, when those needs are not met at a timeline that for us personally is acceptable, or they are delayed, we become frustrated. And when we get frustrated, we often have a shorter fuse. We often become more reactionary. Like think of it, you might be on the bus and somebody bumps you, and because of all that frustration, you really let loose on them, or maybe get in an argument with them, right? And it's the same thing with our children. When those underlying needs are not met, so think of this iceberg as, you know, the behavior is overt, but there's a why to that behavior that's underneath the iceberg. And unless we try to understand what is the root cause of that frustration and anger and anxiety that's coming out in that behavior, we're always going to be reactive. Whereas if we try to find the underlying need, identify it, and try to mitigate it, that's a long-term solution to understanding our students, understanding the members of the community, and working with them. So taking this to the concept of EDI and looking at it within our school system, unfortunately, too often within our schools, we problematize and put the blame on students and their cultures for their failures or what we assess them in, right? Including their level of disengagement. You know, in the theory, we call this deficit thinking. You know, seeing the deficit in the person or their culture or their way of being. But I want to shift the conversation to focus on the system relative to the students versus the students relative to the system. That's not to say, you know, effort and how hard you try is not important factors, but if we only focus on those factors, we miss the big picture, which encompasses a lot more. So in a sense, connecting it back to the first hour needs, we want to understand the why of behavior. Why aren't some students doing well relative to how the system is set up? And what are those needs that we need to mitigate in order to make the system more inclusive, which would benefit everybody? So as you see in this cartoon, it says for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. And of course, we know our children and our students all have different learning needs, different learning styles, different preferences. But some can argue this could also be inclusive because everybody is going to get a chance to climb the tree. And sometimes that's how our school system operates, right? We use an equality paradigm by treating everybody the same, thinking that is fairness, which is not. We'll come back to those terminologies in a bit. So to give you an example, you know, as you've probably heard and been exposed to, the term at risk is so common when we talk about education. A lot of times, you know, people working in education and outside of it are using this term, right? That term is problematic because it designates students at risk of not passing a course, a test, or maybe at risk of maybe dropping out or early school leaving. But the language itself kind of places the holder of at-riskness in the person. So once again, we're blaming their culture, their way of being. We want to shift that language to the language of marginalization, which is about the processes that lead to that outcome of disengagement, of not wanting to be in school, of not doing well. And that will take more effort, but that's really the complexity of the multiple social, political, and economic factors that are intertwining to impact equality of opportunity. So to give you an example, maybe you could think about your own school experiences when you attended school, whichever era it was, right? As much as we like to say the curriculum is neutral, it's not, right? It reflects certain identities, but also creates identities, right? If you think about the textbooks, right? Who is constantly represented? Who is not represented? Who is represented but in stereotypical manner? Those things impact teaching and learning. We know, for example, that TDSP most recently announced that they're going to stop streaming at all levels over the next years, right? So official school curriculum is not an embodiment of neutral knowledge as we like to believe it. It is inescapably political, and it empowers some groups while it marginalizes others. So another way I kind of present that information is inclusion about simply being included, or is it more than that? So if I go back to my last slide of this cartoon, everybody is going to get a chance to climb this tree. So I can argue that it is inclusive because you're all going to get a chance. So, you know, you're all going to get a chance to go to school. But we know it's much more complicated than that because it's a story of power. When I go to school, do I want to be there? You know, are my ideas heard? Am I respected? Do I have good rapport with my teachers and administrators and peers? What kind of school culture is there? And so it's a story of power. And so we can't just talk about inclusion simply as a checklist of if you get an opportunity or not. It's about what kind of experience are you getting access to, if getting that access. So when it comes to teachers, I mean, some things that impact the EDI is, you know, how do you set up your classroom? You know, you want to go away from the traditional desks, but maybe in the COVID era, we do have to stick to that. But, you know, the setup of a circle is much more inviting and builds a community of learners versus a traditional role. How do we deliver the lessons? What type of assessment do we select? A lot of times our assessments are very paper and pencil based, meaning in writing. but how do we value multiple literacies in an era where technology is becoming big, and those skills are becoming much more important to employers, right? So all these factors impact to what extent an inclusive learning environment is developed. So some things to think about is, is competition or cooperation promoted in a learning classroom? Those are two different approaches. What kind of reward system is implemented in terms of how you use your language, mannerism, dress code, way of being? Back in the day, the thought was that, if you're an English language learner, we want to reinforce you only speaking English in class because that will help you master the language. But in fact, we know now that we actually want to encourage you to speak your home language, because by learning your home language and English simultaneously, you're able to master both language and remember them, and that will help you, right? So those are some important differences over time. Do opportunities exist for students, parents, and elders from the community to bring their cultural and experiential knowledge and experiences into the classroom? How can we invite parents to be more involved, not just giving them a phone call about their children not behaving in school? And how do we shift away from just learning from textbooks, which are often Eurocentric and in many cases outdated in this era where knowledge is constantly being reproduced based on technology? So we want to shift from deficit thinking to strength-based thinking. And this takes a lot of effort, but really strength-based thinking focuses on what works. What are the strengths of the person? It's much more equitable. We're working with the identities. We're working on the local needs of the community. We're looking at where is our school situated in relation to the larger community. And that helps build resiliency. It taps into collective responsibility and teaching children empathy and think about social justice, which is what we need in this era more than ever. So how do we center EDI? We want to focus on responses that really address the why of behavior. So what are some action-oriented strategies? You want to be available at critical times. You want to tune into the child and engage them in their interests. You want to build their interests into the curriculum, the formal and the informal day-to-day actions of a school and the community. Redirect, refocus, and respond when it comes to certain problem situations you have to mitigate. And always, always, you're working to create opportunities for meaningful interactions and discussions. Sometimes that's formal, sometimes that's informal. A simple example, if your child comes home from school and you say, how was your day? What's the answer you're often going to get? Good. And that's it. So be more intentional and say, what did you learn at school today? How was your morning relative to your afternoon? Those more specific questions will create those opportunities for some more meaningful discussion. So coming to definitions, equality represents sameness, right? If you're looking at the top left figure in the picture here, we treat everybody the same. They all get a box, but we don't get equality of outcome, which is often what we're talking about. Only two people can still see the game. Here, we want equality of outcome in the second picture to the right, where everybody's seeing the game, but the process is equitable, which is fairness. So the process has to be tailored to their individual needs. In this case, we're talking about height, but you can apply that to race, gender, sexuality, right? We are the sum of all our parts. It's not a A or B kind of narrative. But ultimately, what we're working towards by trying to be equitable is we want to break the barriers in society, which are systemic and a lot of times rooted in our policies and practices that are preventing and being a barrier for people to bring their best, right? So ultimately, we want to shatter that barrier. And if we can do that, that's liberation. And that's something that will take time, will take sacrifice, right? I mean, lots of lives have been lost fighting for different causes in order for us to be on this path of eventually getting to liberation. Now, I want to give you some numbers so you don't think it's just my opinion of EDI and how things go in our schools, right? So once again, language. In my writing, I use the language of minoritized or racialized, and it's different compared to minority or race. Minority is a descriptive word. It's you relative to the larger population or subgroups in the population. Minoritized and racialized, it's about the process of what's enacted on your body relative to society. So here's a definition from a Color of Poverty fact sheet. Racialization becomes a process by which societies construct races as real, different, and unequal in ways that matter to economic, political, and social life. So when I go through the airport, my experience is going to be different than some other groups that go to the airport. When I walk into a store, my experience might be different than some other people. Some other people might never experience that in a negative way. So the difference is socially constructed. If you think about the media representations you see on many shows, they're often stereotypical, and it trickles down to impact children and what they think about whiteness and blackness and brownness and so forth. To give you some stats in terms of the intersectionality of being racialized with poverty, right now more than half of Toronto's population identifies as racialized, 51.5%, and that's probably gone up, right? The highest rates of child poverty, based on the latest census data, is amongst Indigenous, racialized, and newcomer families. Toronto is considered the child poverty capital of Canada, if you did not know that, and that has been consistent over the last 5 to 6 years. We're not doing a good job of taking our most vulnerable and youngest children. 84% of Indigenous families with children in Toronto live in poverty. That's 8 in 10 families. And 1/3 of racialized children live in low-income families in comparison to only 15.1%. So there's a great disparity when we're looking at different social groups. Once again, for me, the question is why, which we have to go and try to seek the underlying causes behind these statistics that have consistently remained there. It's not one and done 1 year to another. We look at the school system, a lot of those statistics translate into what's happening in our schools in terms of the graduation rate, streaming, and expulsion, just to give you a sample. So in 2015, there was a 69% high school graduation rate for Black students, 50% for Indigenous students, versus 84% for white students. So once again, there's a disparity, and the question is, how do we close that gap, or what is contributing to those disparities? Not going to take time reading these. You can kind of take a look, and as I said, we'll make these available. But the same thing when it comes to streaming, a great overrepresentation of racialized bodies, Black, Indigenous, Muslim, Middle Eastern stream. So right now we're working to de-stream, which is a good path we've chosen to be on. And then same thing with expulsion, right? The same behavior by a Black, white, and a brown child, the exact same thing in the same context, we know will be interpreted differently. And so when we look at the expulsion rates, Black, Indigenous, Eastern Mediterranean, Southwest Asians were disproportionately expelled from schools, primary and secondary schools. Black students were 12% of the student population, but represented 48% of all expulsion. That's a gross overrepresentation, which speaks to some of the systemic racism that is embedded within our policies and practices that we have to work towards changing. Let me give you another example with numbers. If all this really, you're like, well, is this really happening all the time, everywhere, right? So we did a study with the organization called YACE, which I've been involved with since its inception in 2007, called Youth Association for Academics, Athletics, and Character Education. Call it YACE for short, because it's a long name, and they particularly operate out of the Jane and Finch community. So they partnered up with the Ministry of Justice to get some statistics. And I want to show you the difference between two neighborhoods and then ask you, based on access to opportunity, which children in these spaces will naturally or typically would do better. And these statistics are grouped by postal code. So if we look at the Jane and Finch neighborhood, which has the postal code starting with M3N, I'm only going to point out a couple of stats here and then give you another neighborhood to do a comparative, right? The incarceration cost, if we round that up, we're looking at 37 million and police expenditure of 30 to 31 million. I want you to pay attention to a couple of statistics here. Percentage of families with one parent, relatively high, 39%. Total population 15 years and over, with no certificate, diploma, or degree, 47%. That's very high considering that York University is literally on the same land within the Jane and Finch community. And you have a median income of $37,000, which is just above the poverty line, right? Looking at the Fraser Report rankings, which ranks schools based on how they perform on standardized tests in the last 5 years and exclusively on that factor. Westview, which is in that community, is ranked 696 out of 725, which is very low. So if you were to judge the quality of a school simply on standardized test results, then you would say this school is not doing well. But in fact, I've worked and I know many teachers and administrators in that building, which there's a great sense of community in that building, but there's lots of issues impacting student learning, which they're working. Now keep these numbers in mind, and I'm going to give you another neighborhood of Rosedale, which is located to Subway and is in close proximity to downtown Toronto. You got an incarceration cost of 0, police expenditure 21 million approximately. But look at some of these differences when we talk about percentage of families with one parent, 11% versus 39, right? Total population with no education, 7% versus 47. And you got looking at a median income about 180,000 versus 37,000. And when we look at the school rankings, we see that the Fraser report ranks North Toronto 14 out of 725 schools. The last stat there that I didn't talk about is that TDSB has something called a Learning Opportunity Index. So they actually acknowledge that what happens outside of school in the community impacts what happens in the school and the learning conditions. So if you are ranked high in the TDSB Learning Opportunity Index, that means you face the highest challenges to student learning. So if you look at the schools in the Jane and Finch corridor, all of the ones listed there all cracked the top 15. Westview is a high school, Brookview, Shoreham, and Driftwood being middle schools and elementary schools. We flip that and look at Northern North Toronto and Whitney, and they're all at the bottom of that list, indicating that there's less barriers to teaching and learning within that community school interface. So if you have to look at such a disparities, it's typically a child within the Rosedale space will do better in terms of gravitating towards teaching and learning, because those barriers are much less. So they have a better chance of bringing out their best potential. So going back to the why of behavior and things, there are a couple of quotes I want to point out to you. Crime itself has no particular denominator, but certain crime has certain elements to it. You take a community with a lack of infrastructure, no support systems, and lots of young people being left to their own devices, and you're going to have problems. Some of these high-density subsidized housing developments do nothing but warehouse people. They ghettoize people. This has been a big problem in Toronto and many other cities as well, and the inevitable results are tragic for everyone. These things were built for disaster. This kind of brings it back to the importance of creating community, creating opportunity and access to community in order for people to do well. And if we only place people for the simple sake of housing without building infrastructure, employment, recreation opportunities, opportunities for business to come into a space, collaboration with different institutions, we cannot really, in a long-term sustainable plan, change some of these conditions that impact their children and families. Here's a quote I'm going to tell you that came out in 1992, which, looking at our context in 2020, is very problematic and perhaps even disturbing. And Stephen Lewis' report came out after the Yonge Street uprisings, which was a way of challenging the systemic racism at the time, right? And this is what is put in the report. And I want you to think about our current context now, post George Floyd death, and we're pretty much in the same space, which is really sad, but also tells us how much more work we have to do collectively and individually, right? In the report, Stephen Lewis wrote, first, what we're dealing with at root and fundamentally is anti-Black racism. While it's obviously true that every visible minority community experiences the indignities and wounds of systemic discrimination throughout Southern Ontario, it's the Black community which is the focus. It's Blacks who are being shot. It's Black youth that is unemployed in excessive numbers. Black students who are being inappropriately streamed in schools. Black kids who are disproportionately dropping out. In housing communities with large concentration of Black residents where the sense of vulnerability and disadvantage is mostly acute. It's Black employees, professional, non-professional, on whom the doors of upward equity slam shut, just as the soothing balm of multiculturalism cannot mask racism, so racism cannot mask its primary target. And once again, for me, the fact that this was in 1992 and 2020, we're still fighting for the same rights for many groups, Blacks, Indigenous, Muslims, right? And so we have to continue this fight, and tells you we need to do it. I'm going to skip that for the sake of time. So really, we live in an era right now where it's embedded with neoliberal politics, meaning, we preach neutrality and trying to be colorblind, when in fact that itself is problematic, right? We cannot glorify one story. For example, a child who's born in poverty with a single parent, they ended up doing well, and we say, well, if so-and-so could do it, why can't everybody else, right? That's what I call glorifying the simple story, because for every story that made it, in regards to beating the odds, there is tens and thousands of stories you never got to hear because their story never made it to be mainstream, right? And that's what's happening in our schools. There's so many children that are falling, as I like to use the analogy of cracks in the system, when we need to be tailoring to the most vulnerable within our schools. Because if we take care of them, it actually benefits everybody holistically. So who is blamed is important. Do we want to blame certain individuals or communities that are racialized, or do we need to focus to a more systemic lens, which is inequality of opportunity, and how our institutions need to work better individually and in sync with each other to try to mitigate some of these. So after Jordan Manners died in 2007, which was the first time a student in Canada in a high school got shot, Dalton McGuinty really pushed for a report. It was called a Review of the Roots of Youth Violence. And this was a very proactive, long-term lens of looking at how do we prevent youth violence. This report, which is available online for free, it identified immediate risk factors and root causes. But there's two things I wanted to point out. One, the report said alienation, lack of hope or empathy, and other immediate risk factors are powerfully but far from exclusively driven by two things: the intersection of racism and poverty, right? In other words, if you feel that, you really hit rock bottom, and regardless of how hard you try, you can't get a fair shot in society, you really stop caring about the consequences of your action. And if you get to that low point, then really picking up a gun or being violent, it becomes irrelevant. And so what do we need to do in order to prevent our youth and children getting to that low point and rock bottom? So kind of shifting the conversation from critique and numbers to perhaps where do we go from here, is I argue that if you want to close the achievement gap in our schools, that's the end goal. We got to kind of take a step back and talk about how do we create access to opportunities. If all our children get access to quality learning, mentorship, tutors, after school programs, holistic learning that is engaging, experiential learning that reflects who they are, their history and culture, the achievement gap will naturally close because we are focusing on the process. So what does this mean in terms of action? We have to invest in programs that view education as symbiotic with the larger community. When children leave school, they don't go to this magical place and come back the next day. What happens in the community impacts it. If there's shootings happening in your community, there is lots of poverty, that impacts the person when they come into the school environment. So we want to invest in more long-term collaborations with external organizations at the local community level, which can help provide the social, culturally relevant, holistic services, right? An example is YACE, which I'm going to talk about in a couple slides and some of the things they've done. And we have to shift, and we all have to do this in our roles. Education and the quality of education and what is a good school cannot be judged simply on standardized test results and their quantifiable indicators, right? Students have to be seen as holistic beings with social, emotional, academic, and psychological needs. So I talked briefly about YACE, where they're located, right? An example of trying to close the opportunity gap is they partnered up with the school board, where they provide a 7-week summer camp in the community where children can attend 9 to 4 p.m. for $150, and that's not per week, that's for 7 weeks of programming. This is only viable and is able to be maintained through cross-collaboration with the school board and even other organizations within the community. So now the community has access to quality programming led by teachers for a very accessible cost. So I'm going to give you some examples of the summer 2017 projects that the students did to kind of bring some of their work and center it. And there was a lot of symbolism that also goes to the logo. For example, the color purple was picked intentionally to try to mitigate some of the gang division north and south of Finch, where one side is representing the blood gang and the other side the Crips. So here was an example of my grade 3 class. We actually looked at identity and who we are, and we did that through the idea of what a passport represents as early as grade 3, looking at those topics. And the part of that pedagogy, you know, being this big word of how we teach, is we have to engage lived experiences, including the pain and suffering our students are experiencing. You know, we know people won't respond to our hurt and our pain, but they'll respond to our anger. And so we have to take time to work through that anger, work through those feelings. Because the Review of the Roots Balance says most youth who feel connected and engaged with broader society, and who feel valued and safe and see a future for themselves, they will not commit serious violence. And we know our safest schools are always places where there's strong relationships between teachers, staff, and students. Here's some example of a student work. Michael Brown, he was in grade 7, and looking at Canada 150, you know, he drew this, and it was so moving for me. It said, 150 years Canada's been free, 150 plus years my people were not. New chains, same meaning. And there's just such a depth to this that you can deconstruct. So we kind of want to, you know, redefine success in our conversations. And what does it mean to make teaching and learning engaging in a way that's socially, culturally relative to the identities of our spaces? We have to also look at it beyond marks, right? We know the importance of physical and mental health, you know, social, emotional, interpersonal, and interpersonal skills. And not everything can be quantified, right? If I teach you how to use your manners, that might take you far in life, but might not translate into an academic test. Pretty much you want to leave off with another example of a student work and look at how when we engage lived experiences, we really bring equity, diversity, inclusion. When the learning is safe, students will open up, and that will translate them doing better in school. So it's only a 2-minute clip, and then I will finish wrapping up because I do want to make sure we have some time. So here is the video.
Okay, so can you describe to me your piece?
Well, this right here, this is all what's in my head. All this right here, this is what I think daily. Yeah. Like, I don't really know myself. That's why I'm just putting why, you know?
And what is the image? Who is this man?
This is a slave, but I think, in a way, this should be me because I feel like a slave to the system.
How so?
Everybody troubles me. Like, if I go somewhere, I get harassed. Like, I just don't feel free. I feel caged.
Can you describe the meaning of that one symbol that you showed me a little while ago?
Bullet?
Yeah.
This represents the emptiness. There's a part of my head that's empty, you know? I need something to fill that void.
What do you think could be used to fill that void?
Maybe my father, but to tell you the honest truth, I don't think my father could fill that void. Nothing can fill that void because I just don't like my father, you know?
So you're feeling towards your father.
Yeah.
Do you think there's an opportunity to learn something from it? So when you have your child, would you duplicate that same thing or would you make it better?
I'll make it better. When I have my kid, I'm gonna take care of him. I'm not gonna do the stupid mistakes that my dad did.
So Nigel, you're a very serious guy, man. You very rarely do you smile.
Yeah.
And you just admitted something to me, man. What did you just say?
Every time I see this picture, every time I flip to it, it makes me smile.
What's up?
All right. You know, that was such a deep example of, you know, a student really opening up and through art sharing how their lives been impacted, at the same time learning and engaging in some important conversation. So I want to leave you with some questions. Oops. Sorry about that. I think I forgot to share my screen. right? So to leave you with some questions to ponder about as we wrap up and engage in some discussions after the talk is, where do we go from here? And for you to reflect on in what ways in your current position you have power. And we all have power in some capacity, your identity, your role, your responsibilities, where you work. How can you share power to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion? I think individually and both as collective and in solidarity with other movements and other groups and social groups. How can you challenge power strategically? Because that's a big part of it. It's not a happy ending story all the time. It takes a lot of energy and exhaustion, so you do have to self-care. So the strategic piece is very important. And always asking, so what? Where do we go here? How can we push further? So I want to leave you with a positive message. My goal is not to get you down, but to be realistic and leave you with a short poem from Tupac, "The Rose That Grew from Concrete." Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete. No one else even cared. And so we have to work on creating the conditions that even though the odds might be against their students and staff or community, to continue to be resilient and overcome those. And it's going to take a collective effort. I wanted to leave off with just pointing out to a couple of resources which we'll make available. I recently wrote a little short article with Dr. Steve Sider at Laurier talking about inequities in the school system and how as we resume to schools and due to the pandemic, how we might re-envision some practices. We supplement that with a podcast. So if you're not a big fan of reading, try to provide a range of different opportunities to engage in the content. There's podcasts, short articles, and then I love movies and documentaries. So two that really bring it home, looking at Ontario context. One is called The Invisible City, with the link it's fully available online, which follows two boys over their high school years. And then Desmond Cole, which is a big time activist in the city, created a documentary and most recently had a book called The Skin We're In, which really looks at some of the anti-Black racism within our city, within Canada. That's it for me. I'll stop sharing and open it up to questions. I can be contacted by email as well as on Twitter. And once again, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here. And I hope you'll find it useful. And I hope the Raptors also win, because I know they're playing tonight and it's an elimination game. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eizadirad. I do have a couple questions here for you that have been asked in the audience. So the first question I have, if we get rid of textbooks, are there any specific alternatives that you can suggest? Textbooks are such an industry. How do we convince teachers and students to let go of textbooks as a crutch, especially for fields such as social studies and history?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think this is where the strategic piece comes in. I mean, there are teachers who are gravitating away from using the textbook where there is the flexibility. Another way is, we want to teach students critical thinking and synthesis and collaboration in this day and age as an important 21st century skill. Sometimes you can work with the textbook and take it apart as part of an activity. So for example, you might say, read this passage and think about what is missing, whose voices are missing. And so you get the students to maybe add or create a subsection to the textbook if you can't get rid of the textbook. I mean, it really comes down to really constantly engaging in these conversations. Some administrators are more open. I know when I taught social studies, I pretty much try to dedicate 1 or 2 days a week to the news, because everything around us, revolves around social events and politics. And so students really get engaged if you even give them the opportunity to bring stuff into the assignments and so forth. So you try to find the open spaces based on the school and the committee and the teacher, and try to work within those spaces and gaps, and engaging in these dialogues with your school principals, with administrators, with your networks, it will create a ripple effect. That's what I say. We all have some capacity to start and engage in this content.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's very helpful. We do have another question from the audience. How do we educate white students about history and current events without re-traumatizing the students of color in the class?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's always when you engage in this, and at the university level, when I do engage in a lot of controversial or topics that make people uncomfortable, I think it's really important before you delve into the topic that you do take some time to get to know the students. I mean, if you're in a teaching capacity where you see the students over weeks or more than once, it's great. It's a bit harder when it's a one and done workshop, but taking some time, just like how I tried to do at the start of this presentation, that, hey, heads up, you might feel uncomfortable. You might feel, angry or sad by maybe some of the statistics of what we talk about, but that's okay. That's part of learning and unlearning and asking, well, why is that happening? Understand the historical piece of how we got here, but then what role do we play? And so it is an emotionally laborsome process. Sometimes it goes much more smoother. Sometimes I say you're planting the seed and some things won't make sense. In 10 weeks or 12 weeks of teaching a course, I can't expect you to gain a full depth of the complexity of these issues. But the goal is to create the parameters where you start engaging in dialogue and you say, hey, you know what? I've always seen and looked at this issue one way, but maybe I should start considering a different perspective. So for me, it's important to create dialogue versus I'm right and you're wrong. If we start off on that note of I'm right and you're wrong, you start going in circles, trying to defend your stance. And then after the whole day, you're exhausted and you haven't really moved anywhere. And so for me, it's about, okay, here's how you see it, but maybe think about it this way, or, a lot of times when I talk about these issues, people will always give me a case of exception. So going back to the simplified story, so-and-so, well, they grew up single parent and in poverty and they ended up doing well. And I always use this analogy. I say, when we're talking about systemic racism, we're not talking about exceptions. We're talking about probabilities. So if I took 100 people in those same social circumstances, yeah, you know what, maybe 10 will do well and overcome the odds, but we're focusing on the 90, because if we focus on the 10, we're missing the boat on the big picture. So let's look at the probabilities, and that's where those overrepresentation numbers come in. And we have to ask ourselves, why do they continuously exist? And how are different social groups impacted? And what processes goes to that? And this is why I was trying to focus on equality of opportunity, which really is about equity and making the process equitable so we can all get to the same outcome of doing well.
Absolutely, thank you. We do have a lot of people in the chat that are thanking you and that are just expressing their thanks and saying how informative that this presentation has been. So thank you so much. We do have a couple more questions here. Another question that we have from the audience: do students of color have a different experience in university versus elementary and high schools?
One more time, can you repeat that, please?
Do students of color have a different experience in university versus high school and elementary school?
I mean, I would say based on teaching across 3 different universities, I think there's still a lot of work to do. I think, racialized Black students, students of color, they are still disadvantaged. Once again, it goes back to that inclusive story. The opportunities are being created for them to access education, but how safe do they feel in those environments? That's a different story. And, a lot of students have come to me and opened up about their experience in class where they don't feel valued. They feel that, the professors are not as supportive as they can be. They're being judged. At the same time, there's lots of great professors. So I don't want to generalize, but I would say if I had to look across the system, if we're talking about Canada or Ontario, there's still a lot of work to do. It's not just making education accessible, which we are trying to do. It's also when they arrive at those spaces, what's the power dynamic within those spaces in terms of interactions, in terms of what is valued, in terms of what clubs are available. So I would say there's still a lot of work to do, but we are on that train of trying to make the change happen as best as we can. And we all have to kind of continue to have those conversations, to speak up in a meeting about, certain voices don't even get to be represented, or if they are represented, they are silenced. There's still a lot of subtle microaggressions that are happening, whether it's in post-secondary, high school, or elementary, and it's those subtle things. And it goes back to what I was talking about, trying to say you're colorblind or you don't see color. That's just as harmful. So we have to be intentional, and that's something we all have to work towards if we want to create a more equitable system.
Absolutely, thank you. Speaking of creating change, we do have another question from the audience, and the question is around what we can do as parents to force the needed change in other community schools. This particular individual has worked for over 20 years in corporate senior finance, and this individual also finds it tough to have these conversations with adults in the workplace to create hiring practices and inclusive cultures. So the question is how we can as parents help others.
Well, I think there's two pieces to it. I think one piece is as parents, it's just tapping into your networks, first individually and then as a collective group of people who are like-minded and who want to create change. That can happen by, attending events, attending workshops, seeing what's available in the community. That's really a starting point, because we can always do more as a collective. And when there's more people who bring an awareness to an issue, it is received with more reception. The other piece is really the strategic piece I talked about, right? If I walk into a staff room and I just say, we need more EDI, and here's how we're going to do it, it might not necessarily get the buy-in, right? So sometimes you have to kind of find out who is your audience, what's their background, and I have to strategically present my case. And that takes time and effort, because you have to get to know, who am I engaging in a conversation with? What is their background? So once again, getting to know who you work with. So in terms of a role of a parent or a corporate leader, the parents, you want to interact with your teachers. You want to ask them, what units are you teaching? Is there opportunities to come in and be a part of school events, to be part of the presentations? You want to be engaged, not just, once again, like asking your child, how was your school day, good or bad? It's the same thing. You want to engage with the administrators. If there's a parent council you want to be involved with, maybe you just say in a corporate world, what if we spark a committee that looks at a list of recommendations that can improve the company in different areas, including EDI. So that's where you have to strategically map out how you want to approach who you're facing relative to the power structure, because a lot of times we are all working in hierarchies, and you don't want to rock the boat in a way that backlashes, and we're all in different positions to take more risks. So we have to be considerate of who can take which risks. And that's, once again, importance of solidarity, allyship, coming together and continuously trying to battle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. And I know that just to add to that, there was a comment from someone else in the audience that said that this question reminds them a lot of the podcast Nice White Parents, which is 5 episodes. So that might be worth exploring if you haven't explored that already, and something to check out and add to your list of resources. Another question that we have here, are there best practices from other parts of the world that can be used here?
Yes, I mean, I think I like the term best practices, but what I often find problematic is we want to copy and paste the best practice, and unfortunately that won't work. We can take a best practice, but we got to tweak and alter it. So for example, in Finland, we know they have one of the best education systems in the world. They gravitate away from teaching by subjects. They're teaching more holistically, less reliance on standardized testing. And we're starting to do that a little bit here, but I think that's an easy example of a best practice that if we think about how they can apply to our context in Canada, because our needs are different, our population is more diverse and less homogeneous. If we can think about that and tailor those best practices, then we can do it. Another example would be outdoor education. A lot of schools in the early years are starting to use, if they have the space available, trying to insert outdoor education into the early years from kindergarten to grade 6, 7, 8. And so we need that piece of children building connections with the outdoors, the spirituality piece of learning how to be to manage your emotions, the social emotional IQ and intelligence. And the earlier we start, the better it will be as the children face more dynamic and challenging circumstances becoming teenagers. So of course, best practice is good, but once again, I think how we apply it is we have to be cautious and we have to be collaborative, so all voices are heard and one person is not deciding what's best for everybody, which is often what happens where politicians are deciding without relevant experience in different sectors what's best.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I believe that is all the questions that we have so far, but if anyone has any last minute questions, this would be a great time to ask. We do have a couple minutes left, so I will just see if any other questions come through here.
I'm just gonna post some resources into the chat since you're here. And I wanted to note that today and tomorrow, there's something going on called a scholar strike, where in solidarity with the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and all forms of anti-discriminatory practice, a lot of professors and people teaching in post-secondary educations are stepping back to bring awareness to these issues. And there's a lot of events being organized. It's called Free Teach-ins. I'm gonna post the website. There's lots of talks happening tomorrow. So if any of them interest you, check it out and take advantage of them. So I'll post that in the chat now, as well as I'll post some of the stuff that were as part of the PowerPoint into the chat while you're here.
Awesome. And as we discussed earlier too, we will be sharing the list of resources. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I will be emailing it out to everyone tomorrow, so you will have access to that. And this lecture is being recorded, so we should have this lecture available to everyone by next week. So you can keep your eye out for that as well if you are interested in referencing back to it and watching it again.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Eizadirad, sorry about that. Eizadirad, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening. We sincerely appreciate you taking the time in the middle of a Raptors game to share all of your knowledge and expertise with us. So thank you so much. We honestly could not have had a better launch to this series, and we are so happy that you are the first lecture of the series. So thank you so much for taking this time to share your knowledge with us today, and we hope everyone here has a wonderful evening. As I mentioned before, we will be sharing all of the resources with everyone. Thank you. We will be sharing all of the resources with everyone, and we also will have a recording that we can share next week.
All right, have a great night with love and respect.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.